Tonight we're joined by Olly Durose. Olly was a fellow 2019 candidate for the seat of Brentwood and Ongar, and he has written a book on the topic of suburban socialism. Olly, I'm not sure, in terms of your further biography, what else I should mention. I gather that you work in the office of David Lanning.
Yeah, I do.
That's your day job.
That's my day job.
And I'm also joined to my left by Jane Berney, who was our 2017 candidate, so hopefully what we can do is provide a little bit of localisation. Olly Durose.
Really grateful to be here. It's a really beautiful place as well, so yeah, thanks so much. I was the 2019 candidate in Brentwood and Ongar. Usually I have to explain what Brentwood and Ongar is, but I'm guessing a lot of you kind of know. It's a very, very safe Conservative seat. It has been since its creation in 1974. And it's a relatively affluent commuter hub in Essex, just outside the M25. And I start the book, which is kind of the motivation for it, at the election count, because we were up against a really healthy Tory majority of about 25,000, I think. And nobody expected us to win at all. We were a bunch of left-wing nutjobs in this really safe Tory seat. Everyone thought we were going to lose. They were right. We did lose. The Tories actually extended their majority to about 29,000. And I couldn't help but think, when I started to reflect on this defeat, this idea of the inevitability of being defeated, because at the election count, this Tory councillor came up to me and said, I told you, Olly, socialism will never happen in a place like this. You'll understand when you get older. And aside from the deep condescension from a Tory councillor, just when you've lost and just when the Tories have had an AC majority, which is not what you want, it was annoying because we'd kind of given him the legitimacy to say that. We'd spent the day canvassing in Harlow because we thought we had a better chance of winning. We also lost there. None of us really thought we were going to win. We didn't give up. We canvassed a lot. A very small and dedicated team of activists door knocked day in, day out for 6-7 weeks. Really, the resignation came in the form of, it was almost psychological. We had all but resigned ourselves to defeat. And so this book really was a desire to embrace naivety and say, what would it mean, really, to win in a place like this? But in a way that kind of extends beyond just our narrow experience of Brentwood and beyond. And that's where this idea of suburban socialism came in. What would it mean to win across the suburban terrain? Because I think parts of the left, whatever that means, have ignored the suburbs as a terrain on which to win. When we think of socialism, I think we think of something quite urban-centric, the Industrial Revolution or protests in the city centres. And I don't think we really try and understand what it means to fight for socialism in the suburbs. And that's why suburban socialism is, at the heart of it, kind of an experience. It's what does it mean? I describe what it's like to stand on a left-wing platform in the suburbs. But I hope that it's more than that. It's not a blueprint. That's what I'm really keen to say. Because a lot of people say, what is suburban socialism then? What is a socialist suburb? What would that look like? And it might be a bit of a cop-out, but for me, socialism is about, is contingent on who fights for it, where it's for, and how it's for. And that's actually why I think the suburbs and why suburban socialism is so difficult to conceptualise, because when we think of socialism, as I said, we're confusing a very urban-centric notion of socialism for a more general view of what socialism is. And so these geographical biases kind of prevent us from thinking about what does socialism mean in the suburbs. So I'll try and keep this quite brief because I really think the Q&A would be great. But I start, after the election count, I try and describe why the suburbs are important to the left. And a key part of it is that 80% of people in this country think they live in the suburbs. I say they think they live in the suburbs because that's really the only evidence we have of what it means for people to live in the suburbs. It's self-reported. I don't give a distinct definition of what the suburbs are. I really try and just encourage people to think of what they think the suburbs are, because I think there's a key distinction between suburban and suburbia. So when we think of suburbia, we have a very clear image in mind. It's the white picket fence, the detached house, the Ford Mondeo reversing out the drive, the nuclear family, and that is, it's not necessarily fictitious, but it doesn't represent the complexity of the suburban terrain, which I think is, far more complex. And instead of trying to say what the suburbs are as a geographical term, I try and describe it in terms of these political and sociological legacies of different kinds of suburbanisation. So I broadly define kind of three forms of suburbanisation. One is, the middle class movement from the city centre to the outskirts for a more secluded, wealthy lifestyle. And I try and describe what middle class could mean to people and how this term, I think, is really, really misunderstood. Everyone seems to define themselves as middle class, which means it's effectively meaningless. So what does it actually mean to lead a middle class life? And also, when we confuse the suburbs with just middle class people, we ignore this enormous range of people who are working class in the suburbs. And I don't mean the typical conservative definition of working class, which is white, you've got a regional accent, you don't like immigrants. That's usually what you think of when the Tories talk about the white working class, for example. But what about a far more nuanced and actually informed idea of what the working class in the suburbs are, which looks at these patterns of displacement? So you look at Chingford or Woodford Green, for example, which is a suburban area. It's increasingly populated by a multiracial working class, displaced from places like Walthamstow. And it's no coincidence that that's a place that Labour did really well in 2017 and 2019. Unfortunately, not enough. But this is, the seat of Winston Churchill, Norman Tebbit, and Ian Duncan Smith. And so I try and describe how the suburbs are changing, and they're not just this middle-class haven, that they're kind of a collection of different people, different races, and different socio-economic backgrounds. And the aim is not to give a definition of the working class and the middle class, because I actually think that's quite difficult to do and honestly not very helpful. Instead, what we should do is ask ourselves, what do we want to get out of this analysis? And for me, it's to avoid culturally reductive and racially reductive notions of the working class that ignore suburbanites, and also to try and ask ourselves, what does it mean to be working class in the suburbs? And to really bring these two groups together and say, what do people in the suburbs have in common? And how does suburban capitalism eventually and ultimately lead all of us, the vast majority of us, to lead a very collectively unfulfilling life? And what kind of coalitions can we build with people in the suburbs? I'll wrap up soon, probably? Okay, sorry, I don't want to ramble on, basically. So the question is, if we have these forms of suburban capitalism, which I go through in the book, vastly unequal home ownership, unpaid reproductive care, forms of suburban securitization which racialise a lot of populations of outsiders, and the suburbanising climate crises, I try and document these kind of things that are excluded from suburban analysis and say, so how can we convince the vast majority of suburbanites that they lead a far more collectively fulfilling life in the suburbs under socialism? And it's all very well and good just to say, well, it would be better if we did this. We really try and have to understand, why is it that so many people in the suburbs are so resistant to radical change, even if we think they would lead a better life under it? And I try and describe what's called suburban realism, which draws on something from Mark Fisher, which is the idea that it's seemingly impossible to imagine an alternative to capitalism, because it's so engrossing in how it dictates our motivations, our behaviours, and this ideological kind of constraint on how we imagine a new life. And so our task really is to break down this form of, this suburban realism. And I go through different forms of what I call suburban solidarity, which is really a way of not just telling people on the doorstep, we should nationalise rail, this is why, and they'll say, I don't want to do that. What it is actually showcasing through our actions why socialism in the suburbs works and why it's preferable. And through our actions, such as suburban mutual aid, which has been resurgent during the COVID crisis, this is an example of people actually showcasing and behaving in a way that exudes socialist principles. It's about saying that my health is dependent on yours, yours on mine, we're all better off together. And it's about harnessing these kind of solidarities in a way that chips away at people's deep commitment to suburban capitalism. And then I kind of build up to this idea of the Suburban Manifesto, which is gets more into this kind of like utopian style thinking of what it could mean. And I have just these ideas that kind of we're all familiar with, which is the idea of socialised housing, suburban care service, democratising our workplaces, and forms of free public transport. And I won't go into the details of them because you can ask them or you can read them about them. But it's actually less about the detail of what society we will offer, and more about what these solidarities calling out for, and how can our campaigns meet the demands of what people are already asking for on the ground and what they are expressing in their actions. And then finally in the book I kind of go into these two different directions, which is how I kind of justify why I'm personally not convinced by the forms of moderation and pragmatism that currently, you could say, define the Labour Party. I'm more of the belief that we have two options in front of us with the impending climate crises, which is socialism or barbarism. And personally, if we don't have socialism, there is only one ending to this outcome. And so I really welcome your discussion of this, because I think it's really interesting about these idea of progressive alliances, which I personally am not a fan of and not in favour of, although I can understand why our electoral system seemingly pushes us to make these kind of these decisions. But yeah, I think it would be great if we opened up to questions and we can have your thoughts and discuss more on the book. But yeah, if anyone has any questions then. And I also should say, if you would like to buy a copy, then we've done a discount, so it's £10, and then half the profits will go to your CLP and half to the publishers, and I'll get a smidgen of a percentage from that. So yeah, but yeah.
Thanks, Olly. So thank you for that brief introduction. I'm just looking at the time now. It's 5 to 8, so I suggest we'll open up for about 20 minutes of Q&A now, and then we'll have a little bit of a break for refreshments at that point. But thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the book, which I found quite thoughtful and certainly interesting for me in terms of this constituency. I think, it's interesting, I think, for all of us as past candidates to read someone else's introduction, and a lot of the things that were most striking about it were the kind of the mundane aspects and the mechanics of campaigning, and the mechanics of campaigning when it's an inconvenient time, and getting volunteers to show up on the street at a certain time and to put a canvas session together and to get leaflets done, and the mechanics of it was very familiar. But as I said, the other side of it, I think, that was very interesting for me, in terms of suburbanism, this is a constituency which is becoming more suburban. So I picked Olly up on the way here today at Stansted, and it had taken him 45 minutes to get out of Liverpool Street, and that cuts both ways. So certainly, I think all up and down that, the London-Cambridge corridor, is suburbanising. These are settlements that increasingly are economically dependent on London, and this constituency increasingly is economically dependent on London. I think that's where there's a lot of parallels and interest in the book. But I didn't mean to start usurping you. What I'll do is if we'll take questions from the audience first, and we'll jump off from there. Sam.
As women, many of us have experience of having to use childcare and also dropping children off to school. There's a difference living in the suburbs where you don't have access to public transport and we end up having to use cars to get everywhere. So I just wondered, one of the main causes of carbon emissions and other types of greenhouse gases is the use of cars in rural areas, and that compares to urban areas where you have much better transport systems and they are more subsidised. So I just wondered, Jane, have you got any experience of that sort of problem?
The real problem here is there is no public transport, because I originally started out in a village and I spent my entire life driving the children. Even though the children went to school on a bus, if they did an after-school event, which we didn't do very often, there was no bus to get back, so I'd have to go and pick them up, which actually severely restricted how I could work. So I didn't work because, fortunately, I was in a position where I didn't have to, because my job would have involved going into London. But there's just no transport. I mean, I now live in Saffron Walden, and you have to getting to Audley End station, you either have to get to a bus, which is very infrequent, and actually is quite expensive, actually, or you have to pay an exorbitant amount to park at the station, which is, so it's really just the lack of public transport, or the fact that we even need it here, that is the real problem, I think, and it impinges everybody. So I have quite a few sort of my neighbours who are actually traditionally would vote Conservative. As soon as you mention the railways, they're all for nationalising them, which is quite surprising, and I think we ought to be bolder in that. But I think it's just a real area, anywhere, particularly in a rural area. Travel is a real problem, and it affects everybody from getting to school, to getting off to school clubs, or even going for interviews and things like that. And like when my son wanted to do some work experience in London, it's an awful lot of money to get down to London just to do it for a week when you're not being paid. And that was to work for, he actually managed to get some work experience with Alan Hazelhurst, who was our previous MP, who did actually pay. But if he hadn't have paid for it, it was over £100, and that sort of thing is a real, it really does hurt people's, or affect people's potential and ability to do things.
It kind of ties into what you were saying about the mechanics, and you're saying the mundaneness of canvassing. So in the second chapter I talk about what it's like. Yeah, you knock on the door and nobody answers, right? Especially if you're going through the day. What this really signifies is that everybody's at work, and this was frustrating because it ties into what you're saying. We're trying to tell people that we can live in a society where we wouldn't have to work all the time. We'd have more time for community care and leisure. We can't do that because everybody's at work. So it's like this, vicious cycle. And the people that would answer the door were generally women who were looking after their kids or elderly relatives. And it really did expose, this huge inequality in reproductive labour, which is unpaid, unrecognised. And I think this is really strong in suburbia, especially because of this, the ideology of the family, particularly the nuclear family, which I think is a tool basically to justify the deeply unequal and gendered compartmentalisation of reproductive care and labour that otherwise could be shared by all of us. And you ask, how do we try and really change that? And how do we convince people that we can live in a different society? And one example of, say, the mutual aid that I was talking about was there's examples of local communities setting up their own forms of like childcare sharing, where groups of women will come together and say, can you look after my kids for this day? And you look after mine for the rest? And you have these like mini creches that almost form in these communities. And they're not waiting for any kind of like state intervention to do that. They're doing it themselves. Because the Tory government aren't going to help set this up, and that's an example of what communities can do themselves to showcase socialism, to practice socialism, and then when it comes to the election, your doorstep, and you say, we think that childcare should be paid for, it should be free, universal at the point of use. Imagine even having actually like a wage and a salary and compensation for domestic work, which could then be shared amongst the community, not just put on to predominantly women. And obviously the car aspect is key, and the suburbs effectively are built on the car. There's examples in the US of communities literally being planned to ensure that a car is the dominant mode of transport. And it is obviously quite difficult to change that ourselves architecturally, other than to kind of rebuild and to think of new suburbs to build, like they did in 1950 with the new towns. We could do that, but now we can actually think, how can we build it in a more sustainable way that doesn't revolve around, as you say, the individual car, which is deeply, deeply environmentally damaging.
I'd echo a lot of what you said about there from a planning point of view, and about how we rethink our settlements, rethink our communities and how we live, because it's not, as you say, the car doesn't have to be central to how we build settlements in future. And that's, if you look at this area, there's a lot of building happening at the moment which is not part of any structured larger plan. But if you start to conceive new settlements, then those have to be built in a way where they are more self-contained and less dependent on people moving twice a day in and out by car. So I think there has to be a change in how we work there. I mean, so James said something that's really interesting about rail nationalisation, but I think it's the state playing a larger role in transport generally. Yes, that was absolutely popular with the electorate in 2019 as well, which I'm sure won't surprise you. And I think it's part of a broader subset of things in the 2017 and 2019 manifestos which chimed with people, where if something had been in public ownership, or where the state had played a larger role within people's lifetimes, you'd see it had a degree of plausibility with them, which was far greater. So the one from 2019 that was viewed with the most scepticism on the doorstep was the free broadband one, that people couldn't understand the idea that the state played a role in providing internet access because they'd never had that, and they didn't understand further to that why it should be free, because even if the state were doing it, surely there'd be money, in the same way that they, when an older person that you're having this conversation would compare it to a water rate, is how they'd framed it. So it's very interesting how receptive people were to the state or society taking a larger role in bits of the economy where it's been absent. And I think those are things that we have to remember as we look at what went right in 2017 and 2019. There were bits of those pitches which were really attractive to people, and there were bits which I think were harder sells. Especially, I think, in 2019. I think the 2019 manifesto was a harder pitch to people. The other aspect of it is that we've moved forward. So in 2017, everyone thought we were going to lose. In 2019, I think we were subjected to criticism in a whole different way than we were at the previous election. Next questioner, I think.
It's not just property owners. The suburbs are now much more full of renters because of the impossibility of house prices. And it always seems to me this is something that Labour should be able to make more pay of. I think when Miliband did, we proposed longer tenancies, that kind of thing, and that we ought to be able to do a lot more with. Do you think there's things that the party could be doing in terms of housing in the suburbs, or is that a third rail because of the obvious issues with those who already own property not wanting any more of them?
Yeah, great question. I mean, one of the myths about suburbia is it's just a ubiquitous place of home ownership. Everyone owns their own home. And, to a certain extent, for potentially a generation, that's more true. But the idea of me owning a house in the suburbs is just laughable. It's just not going to happen. And you're right that it's increasingly populated with private renters and social tenants. When we door knock, I'm sure it's similar for you guys. We have more of a chance if we canvass in social housing. But the key point I try and make is we have to find a way of showing people that socialised housing is better for all of us. So obviously the people that will benefit most are obviously insecure, precarious renters and those in, deteriorating social housing. But I try and make the case that even those who have, mortgaged homeowners, a system of socialised housing is significantly better for everybody for several reasons. If you take like a mortgage homeowner, increasingly they're in debt, particularly if we look at the increasingly unstable economy, which an investment can be increasing one day and then one bad investment or one recession or one job loss can be repossessed. Also the inflexibility of it. I know it's not exactly like the world's tiniest violin for like mortgage homeowners, but I mean, if you've made an investment and then suddenly you get a new job and you want to move, it's incredibly difficult to do so, which is why the average commute is increasing and increasing, because people are hanging on to their homes more often, even if their job moves further away. And that only then reduces the availability of housing for everybody. Another way is, say, take me, I lived with my parents for 2 years after uni, which was not as long as I intended to do so. And that wasn't good for me, and it also wasn't good for them. I think, parents would like a system of housing where their children don't depend on them for housing for the rest of their lives. And so in terms of what the Labour Party are going to do, I think it would probably be unreasonable of me to expect Keir Starmer to come out and say, we're literally going to socialise every house in Britain, even though I think that would be great. But I do think we can make a case for vastly more investment in social housing. I do not believe that the promise for, I think it was 100,000 new social homes, maybe even more, I don't think that was unrealistic. I don't think that was unpopular. And I don't see why we should, renege on that commitment. Because it's really important also to change the narrative of what social housing is. Right now, because it's so underfunded, nobody wants to live in social housing. And when I tell my friends, we should all live in social housing, they'll be like, well, why would we do that? Look at the state of social housing. And that's the point. They underfund it to the point where they dismantle the idea that this is what we should all do. What about forms of luxury social housing where we can have in the suburban environment still keep this personalised narrative of what it means to have your own space, but that's communally owned. You can have your own space, but then when you move on, you don't get to reap the profits. It goes back to the community, and then it can be left for someone else. So I don't have an answer of how we convince everybody that socialised housing is the best. However, we can look to cooperative forms of housing that have been experimented across the globe, and again, it's not just this idea of telling people, it's showing people with our actions, with forms of cooperative forms of ownership, which itself is also demanding, I understand. But yeah, it's tough, but hopefully...
Can I just say something? I think it might be worthwhile looking at what happens on continental Europe, because I used to live in Amsterdam, and at the time I was working for one of the big four auditing firms, as were all my people I was working for, and they all rented their accommodation, and I was utterly bemused about it. And the only reason I found out about it was I was talking to one of my friends, and she said, I'm having a new kitchen this weekend. I said, that's lovely. I said, but I thought you rented it. So yes, but we have a long lease. It's very nice, it's a very nice flat. And I put my own kitchen and I decorate. So there's a completely different attitude to housing than we have. It might be worth looking in there at that sort of thing and why that should be so. But also another thing I think we have here is that we've got all these buy-to-lets. So, people are going to use, I know people are using their house and buy-to-let, but that's their pension.
Yeah. If we're in a situation where we think that's the go-to investment,
Yeah.
they can't invest and they can't get a good return on the saving or anything else. But I was dealing with some tenants this week through my job who the owners were people who bought the house to fund their mother's care. And they were an African family who moved to Harlow from London. They complained about the damp. The people who owned it just couldn't afford to fix it. And it didn't seem to be working for anyone.
No.
The system we have at the moment, not even for the landlords, really.
I think, in the last 40 years we've seen home ownership held up as like the holy grail. And speaking from personal experience, when I divorced and left my home, there wasn't any equity talking about it anyway, so I haven't been able to ever get back onto the property ladder, as it's called. but I was fortunate enough to find an Alderley End estate rented home, which is where I've been for 10 years. And because I knew that I could stay there for years and I wasn't going to be moved out like I was the previous 2 places, I did exactly that, put a new kitchen in, new flooring in, and I've lived in my home, it's been my home, because I knew I could stay there as long as I kept working, and which why would I not? And that's really made me a lot more comfortable than I was in private rental accommodation, where you're subjected to whatever they need to do with their property. And so for me, it's really important that we change this narrative about it's so essential for everyone to get on the property ladder. No, it isn't. We need to have a kind of social housing, and we need to not call it council housing, because there's still too many people for whom that is a negative. There's too many people of my generation, in particular, that would see that as a negative, because we grew up in the 80s listening to Maggie Thatcher, telling us to buy, and each for themselves.
I'm sure we'd all hope that in the long run what we could do is actually change the connotation of the word, because I don't think council housing should be viewed as a negative thing at all. I also think for this constituency especially, in terms of a large, what does a large programme of building social housing mean for a place like here? Well, the biggest political issue in Uttlesford is development. The charge that's most commonly levelled at the development that we do have here is that it's not for local people, that too much of the housing is large commercial housing. They're large detached mortgage properties that are initially owner-occupied, and then they start to drift in. You notice they drift into private rented ownership as a development matures usually. And that's not the shortage of housing that we have in this constituency. So when we're talking about planning and the failures that are happening at Uttlesford, that we're not building at all, that we're perpetually unable to agree a local plan, what would be lovely to see would be to be part of a national programme of house building that really was directed at our need, that was social rented accommodation, which is the thing that we're most short of. And even within that, the largest proportion of the housing waiting list is for single occupancy properties. It's for flats and bungalows and smaller properties, and that stuff doesn't get built at all. So I think it can be a pitch that's effective for this area. It can be transformative for us, and I know many of us there's people within the Labour Party that we know who are in the position of being forced out of the communities in which they grew up, in which they lived, because of the dearth of social housing and the fact that there just isn't availability, and they're forced to move further out the area. So I think it has absolutely relevance for here in that respect.
There must be other parts of Europe, if nowhere else, that have got models that we could be looking at, and I don't know how much work or how who does that kind of work to look at what they're doing and what works, and could we adopt a sort of combination of models, because not every model is going to suit every suburban area.
My friend is part of this campaign in Berlin to repossess, socially repossess a very, really, really wide area of housing, and they succeeded. And that is, to me, that's fantastic. It's also mad to think that could happen, and it did. And so that's one kind of example of local democracy potentially working. Obviously, the barriers are then to how do you go and get this referendum and then how do you win. But that was seen as a really, really radical move. Unfortunately, it was at the same time as the centre-left, rather than the more left-wing party, won the election, and the governor, I don't know, or it's a mayor, I can't remember, in Berlin, might not let it go through. So it's kind of this battle. But I just think what you said was really interesting about not letting home ownership be the ultimate goal. And it's tricky because I'm often called a hypocrite when I rent, But when people say, oh, so would you not like to own your own home? I'm like, of course I would. Because like, it's the only form of like, economic security that really exists. But you're right, it's what's annoying is when political parties centre their housing policy on, let's make it easier for people to own their own home. Well, they don't mean that. They mean let's make it easier for a slightly larger section of people to own their own home while everyone else doesn't. Because home ownership, private home ownership by nature is exclusive and exclusionary. Otherwise, the investment is invaluable. So I'd much rather a party here focuses on how can we make social housing more available and more desirable for people. But yeah, it's interesting that the social housing was difficult in Brentwood because I used to say this on the high street, so we want more social housing. It was usually people on the high street with pinstripe suits saying, you can build it, just don't build it here.
Yeah.
And it's because they're worried about what it will do to the aesthetic of the area. And that's deeply upsetting to hear. It's insulting as well. And that is, an ideology that's tricky to combat.
It seems that Germany has had this tradition of people being far more content to rent than to buy throughout the country. So I think they're probably on a better footing than we are, because we've always had this encouragement for people to buy. But over there, the rental system is so fair, and people are very, very happy with it, whereas there's an incredible amount of discontent in this country. That started landlords. That started because of Margaret Thatcher allowing the right to buy, and then all of a sudden, people who were perfectly content to rent their whole lives suddenly felt the desperate need to buy their property. And why wouldn't you if you could?
I'm the president of the Council of State, the largest council of state in Europe up until the 1970s, which is Beacon Street in East London. And it was quite nice. Everybody had street works, they all worked at Ford's, nobody had a car. My mum and dad bought their house to a GLC mortgage in 1977. And the Labour Party had as one of its policies, which is got in the 74 manifesto, the right of council centres to buy their home. The difference was the fact you gave them away. It was ready for jam. And the money raised from those sales ended up basically being only used for repair, housing, repairs and maintenance. So, for example, in Newham, where I worked, we had 60,000 properties in 1980. By the mid-1990s, we had about 23,000, mostly flats. Like the ones with, non-working lifts, problems in terms of concrete walkways, all those things. So it was all very negative. But I did kind of find it worrying. And I think something a few weeks ago in The Guardian about Angela Rayner, she talks about the raised a council estate as if she's been raised by wolves. But my parents were a bit rough. They were Irish and working class after all. They were never quite feral. So basically, I was finding it quite worried. And what they also said was, framing your background in politics like that, being from a council estate means absolutely, I might swear because we're in church, absolutely nothing to most of the voters, especially those on the forward. They haven't got a clue. I had to explain to my kids what a council flat was, because we used to see Marlmare's Dustin, which used to serve. They didn't know what a council flat was, right? And basically, they've lived in this area since more or less were born. So a bunch of their friends are quite rich, quite affluent, they have swim pools, jacuzzis, second homes, jacuzzis, one's got a helicopter. I can't compete with that as a dad, obviously. There's not how many times I read The Cat and the Cat came back to my bedtime. So basically, it's sort of, to me, I think we need to revive council housing, more secure long-term tenancy, point made by Conrose earlier. In Europe, continental Europe, France, Germany or Holland, you've got longer-term tenancies, you've got more rights of sort of security in terms of tenure. You've got red caps. I think there was a red cap debate and referendum in Berney a few years back. I could bore you for hours about council housing, but I do think there was a positive side of it. Housing associations, on the other hand, are very good at sort of doing the wraparound stuff. They're looking at sort of how training and sort of all those sort of things that can help people. So the problem we've got is, by the end of the 90s, the only people who were really qualified for council housing were people that were either in huge hardship, in priority need. So basically, from the estate that I grew up on, where most people were, dads worked, mums worked part-time, like mum worked in a factory, the dad worked in the building game, sort of just to estates that were almost full of people with benefit claimants. So the whole perception of it, 70% of new council tenants by the end of the 90s were on housing benefit. So that the whole perception of it was, housing, like Mrs. Thatcher's comment, if you're on a public protected bus when you're 30 or a failure, if you're housed by the council, essentially you're one of those people that are losing out, you're in the bottom third. And we have to try and change that in the perception of it. And what people forget was some of the nicest houses we ever had, we sold off the buttons. And they just went for buttons.
Jane?
All I was going to say was that it's Abbotsford's policy at the moment to have 40% social housing, but that social housing is 80% market rent, so it's actually very, very high. The estate that I'm in, I'm actually surrounded by social housing, although I own my property, well, with a small mortgage. But when you get to my age and you're retired, to actually pay that sort of rent is absolutely impossible, and I wouldn't get benefit because I'm sort of above the limit. So I simply wouldn't be able to afford to rent, and that's one thing that, big advantage of actually owning a house is that at least it gives you some security or the ability to survive as you get older.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I say if I could, absolutely I would, because as you say, it's I'm paying so much of my salary on rent, and as it said, people say it's cheaper to be rich, because if you have less money, you have to rent, which means you're wasting more of your income on rent, whereas if you're owning your own home, you're spending less of your income on rent. I would just add, I didn't really give you an answer to the policies thing, Olly. I'd say just quickly, I firstly love John McDonnell's policy in 2019, even though in the book I described I got the most pushback from that out of any policy that I defended, which was the kind of the inversion of Margaret Thatcher's right to buy, where he said, I don't know if, he said, if you are a renter, you can purchase your house from your landlord at a lower than market rate, I think, or maybe it was market rate, I can't remember. It was, the landlord would have lost out on their initial investment, but they wouldn't have been out of pocket. But I remember defending that in a hustings. I'd never received groans and boos before like that. And a lot of them actually were coming from, I saw one of my campaigners booing me, like a Labour campaigner. She was only there for the start, and she swiftly moved on after that. And she came up to me afterwards, she said, you can't do this, you're punishing aspiration. Turns out she's a landlord. And again, I think there are valuable discussions to be had about this policy. I'm not saying that everybody else has to agree with it. I liked it because it was kind of instead of purchasing property away from the community, it was almost a way of kind of taking it from this landlord class, even if it was, again, letting somebody own their own home. And I just say this was an example of what I say is suburban realism, where it was such a visceral reaction to this idea of the thought of somebody losing their investment of what they own and being able to do whatever they want with what they own, which is a house they don't live in, which they don't do anything to, they don't produce any value in society, they literally are just taking money from somebody, and she hated that. And that was very strong, I think, in the community. Is this idea, it's impossible to imagine ownership collectively in our capitalist, hyper-capitalist environment, and that's what we need to try and
you need to know that people are so angry about that and not about Devon's taxpayers being fleeced by council houses being given away for nothing.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Because we all would, if we owned the house, unless the market, thanks everybody, I don't blame anybody for doing that. I would do it myself in a heartbeat, but it's not an option. They aren't around anymore anyway.
Also, my mum always says to me, she's like, I owned a house when I was 25. She says to me, and she's like, you should why, what's happened? She's obviously understands I can't, but she's always a little dig. She's like, I, by the way, used to own a home when I was 25. And I say, yeah, because you used to get 100% mortgage, or 95% mortgage, and your job literally said, we're going to help you get this. She worked for a mortgage bank, so they helped to get her out of the house. And it's just not possible anymore. And I think this idea of ownership being private ownership being a viable goal for people, it just doesn't exist anymore. And there is, I think, a generational gap. I'm not saying that there's this homogenous idea of conservative socialists, not at all, but there is a generational gap, I think, with what is feasible for the younger generation. But yeah.
I think one of the great things as well is that back in those days, credit was actually very regulated, so you might have to wait quite a long time to get a mortgage. It might be more difficult in some ways, but they just kind of turned on the taps, and what you've got now is inflated prices. You know, now you just have to borrow huge amounts of money because there's too much money chasing not enough property.
I was just going to say, it's a really interesting observation that is the policy that got the most pushback. I think there's a couple of different things going on there, and one is the conflation of personal property and private property, which is something that's deeply, deeply internalised. And I'm not sure how you challenge that. I think gradually. I think the Labour movement has challenged that historically, going back to the mass trespasses, the idea that there is, I think, a distinction between personal and private. I think the other aspect of it is, people that become buy-to-lets landlords, or people that just want to own their own homes, in opting out of the public or social realm, in making individualistic choices, they're not necessarily doing that, I think, out of a deep sort of philosophical belief, but because there's just a complete absence of faith that the state will ever be there, that society will ever be there to support people. And how you win that back, again, I think gradually is the cop-out answer to it. But what I tended to do most in those cases, and it touched on what I said earlier, is appeal to sort of modernism with a dash of nostalgia. And you keep tapping people with the idea that some things used to actually work better, they used to actually work like this, and you could lean on the post-war consensus. And if you define that as, the Attlee government as a aborted project towards socialism, people kind of reject it. But if you appeal to things that were right when they were younger that are tangibly worse now, suddenly people are much more receptive to it. You've depoliticised these issues, which are in fact, they're fundamentally political. They have their root in government and public policy. It is interesting that that's the one that had most pushback. Jane, I don't know if you had any other thoughts.
Going back, you talking about sort of depoliticising things, I think one of the things I did experience, I was a candidate in 2015 and 2017. As soon as you said the word socialism, people were terrified. You're going to take everything away, and we're going back to the sort of Dr. Zhivago and the death of the personal life, and you can be off to the gulags and things. But then sometimes when you explain things a bit different, like my thing was about nationalising the railways and actually nationalising the utilities. And I was used to saying that people didn't realise that actually every other state can own our railways except our own government, because Greater Anglia is owned by the Dutch, and so we're paying dividends to the Dutch. And when I lived in Holland, yeah, exactly. When I lived in Holland, we used to have this game. When people came to visit, we'd go to Saffron Station in Amsterdam and watch all the trains leaving on time, and they always did. This wasn't Germany, this was Amsterdam. And so, but when you sort of start explaining those things to people, it then sort of diffuses it, and it doesn't seem quite so scary. But I think, go back to the housing, one model's not going to fit all. And it all links in also to sort of social care for the elderly, and people getting upset about having to sell their house to pay for their care. Because it's very deep-rooted that this was something I wanted to live with my children, which I don't actually understand. I have this argument with my mother all the time. But it's something that we need to sort out and address quite fundamentally, because it's ruining people's lives.
Do I have time to give one more example about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's just fascinating you say about this idea of the word socialism, because the chair of Brentwood Labour, Richard Millward, I don't know if you know him, he's very socialist himself, but he refuses to say that word on the doorstep for that very reason. We have this discussion a lot. I don't personally know, I think, about whether I want somebody to identify as a socialist, even if they kind of agree with all the things I'm saying. Because obviously, what's the point in going, so you want to nationalise the railways and you want social housing, but I don't really want your vote unless you tell me you're a socialist. Obviously not. At the same time, I'm kind of sceptical of should we hide history of socialism? And obviously that's what you're saying, and I think one example I have is I met this elderly couple in Brentwood, and John and Doreen Axon, they're called,
That's in the book, yeah.
You know,
You said that.
I said the book, yeah. And John was turning 99 on the 13th of December. He voted for Clement Attlee in 1945, and he was going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn on his 99th birthday. And basically they told me what it felt like to vote for Clement Attlee and what it meant. And you know, it reminded me of, we've had the NHS now for 60, 70 years, and the thought of, we talk about kind of broadband and how it was laughed at and all these ideas of other like ownership. At that time as well, there was deep scepticism from a small but very loud section of society of why the NHS is what they called Hitlerian coercion, because it's coming off the Second World War. And I think we've seen similarly kind of dogmatic and inflammatory language to describe some of our policies. And I was, asking myself, why is it that the NHS is now so universally kind of cherished by even the most right-wing people? Not always, but why is it kind of a very popular institution, yet all other forms of socialism, for example, are laughed at? And it's a bit of a circular argument, which is to say that once it's in place, people see it works, they like it. But then, I was looking more into the history of the NHS, which I'm sure a lot of people know anyway, and it wasn't invented by the Labour Party. It was practiced as a form of mutual aid by miners in South Wales. They took it into their own hands and they said, we're fed up with this kind of private healthcare, so we're going to pool our resources and have a form of socialised healthcare. And then other people were kind of paying attention and going, hang on, this actually kind of works. Healthcare is much cheaper for them, while I'm paying all this private healthcare. And this middle class was kind of excluded from this working class institution of healthcare. And it was Nye Bevan, not the other one, yeah? Nye Bevan, who was from this town, Tredegar, it's called in South Wales. And then he said in 1945, we're going to Tredegarise you and say we're going to build the NHS. And they won an election on the basis, not only of that, but on that policy. And I think this is a prime example of what we have to try and emulate, which is that if we can build these movements of mutual aid in our societies that don't just, that provide food, prescription services, all these things we're doing during COVID and maybe imagining more forms of provision. If we can do that and actually people can see how socialism works in the form of universal and unconditional provision of basic goods, and then we build a manifesto that builds on that, that's how I think we can win in even the most conservative areas, like Brentwood, like here. And I think John and Doreen were kind of like perfect encapsulations of this, so they've lived through this amazing history. Sadly, Corbyn didn't win. But yeah, that was quite an inspiring moment to meet them. And it reminded me, people have been fighting for socialism for a long time. I kind of only just jumped on the bandwagon like 3 years ago. And if the only optimism I have is that is potentially what our model should be.
But thank you very much, Olly.
No, thanks so much.